Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I know we have attendees from across the globe. So welcome to this webinar, Best Practices for Collecting and Validating Vendor Banking Details you receive via email. Now, the goal of this webinar with Sarah Quell, Natai Barzam, and myself, Debra Richardson, is to provide you with immediate takeaways that you can put into your manual process today, but then also provide you with an automation solution that you can present to your leadership to add more security and avoid fraudulent vendor payments in the future. Now, some housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded, and we will send you a link to the recording within 3 days, but most likely you'll see that in your email tomorrow. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. We will save those questions for the Q&A session, which will be at the end up to 15 minutes prior to the end of the webinar. And if we don't get to all of your questions during that Q&A session, we will follow up via email, or you can ask additional questions via email if you think of questions after the session. Now, don't forget to download the handouts. We do have a PDF of the presentation, and then we also have a brochure from myself and also from nsKnox. Now, I do want to introduce the speakers here, and I will go ahead and start. I am Debra Richardson. You may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. Now, I do have a site that is dedicated to improving your vendor processes, and I work with lots of AP vendor teams that still have manual or partially manual processes to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices in their vendor process so that they pay the right vendor. Natai, you want to go ahead and go next?
Sure, thanks, Debra. So, hi everybody. My name is Natai Barzam, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of nsKnox. I have many years' experience in cybersecurity and enterprise software, and I'm working closely with finance professionals globally in securing their payments against cyber-enabled fraud. Excited to be here with you and share some of these experiences.
All right, thanks, Natai. All right, Sarah.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Sarah Quayle, and I am the Manager of Accounting Operations at Viga LLC. I have years and years of experience in accounts payable and accounts receivable, and I have been with Viga for about 2.5 years and manage a team of 12 professionals in AP and AR. Happy to be here today and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Natai. All right, so with that, now that you know a little bit about us, let's talk about what we will go over today. So here is the agenda. So we're first going to look at fraud and vendor banking, and then we're going to take a look at a 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process: authentication, validation, and management. And then we're going to apply each of those 3 steps to vendor banking. And then we're going to turn that over to nsKnox to talk about fighting fraud in corporate payments with their automated solution. All right, so fraud and vendor banking. So looking at the U.S. first, you're looking at a U.S. maps, and the stats are really taken from the FBI 2020 report of IC3 complaints. Now, you can check your state to see where you fall, but the average complaints per day jumped 50% from 1,300 per day in 2019 to 2,200 per day in 2020. No surprise there, as fraudsters really took advantage of the abrupt and, for most, continued move to work remotely. Now, business email compromise scams, where a fraudster attempts to trick APT members into believing they are your company leadership or they are your vendor to add or change vendor bank details, that decreased in the number of incidents from just almost 24,000 in 2019 to just under 20,000 in 2020. However, the cumulative amount in 2020 increased, giving that an average loss of $92,000 per incident for the year, which was up from 71,000, just over 71,000 for 2019. And this is a global issue. The FBI partners with the International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol. And Interpol is an intergovernmental organization with 194 member countries. And in October 2019, they launched a public awareness campaign for business email compromise with the hashtag BEC Careful. Now, the FBI also reported in their 2020 IC3 report the top 20 international victim countries, with the UK being the largest at 216,633 incidents reported. But the key here for global fraud is really to be proactive and implementing authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, and also those automated solutions to add that extra layer of security, because no AP vendor team member can be 100% all day, every day, to spot these fraudulent emails, especially as many AP team members are still working remotely or some way affected by the pandemic. Now, we know that fraud is a global issue, and we also know that if fraudulent payments don't go out, it saves your company money and it gets your vendor paid faster. But what we haven't talked about is the effect on you or your team. So while we know fraud is evolving, you may not be aware of is so are the actions that companies are taking against employees. Now, in the US, I've only heard of employees being let go, which is bad enough, but in the UK, there have been at least 2 incidents where companies are taking stronger actions. So in the first one, a worker was fined $7,500 because he wired 3 payments totaling almost $512,000 without confirming with the client, which was their process. The second incident, an employee was actually sued because she paid a cyber criminal a net of $138,000. Now, the judge did rule in her favor, but in one subsequent article, that employee stated that she considers herself unemployable due to that lawsuit. And if you have any trouble selling any improvements to your process to leadership, just let them know that a company in Australia fired both their CEO and CFO after a $61 million fraud occurred. Now, again, they were both sued, and while the judge, again, dismissed the cases, there is still the threat, and it's really just adding to the trend of employers taking action against employees. So let's look at what you can do to always pay the right vendor. Okay. But before we get to that, I am going to go ahead and launch the first poll question. And that question is, what do you currently require before, let me get that launched. Okay, you should see that now. So what do you currently require before adding or updating existing vendor bank details? A, bank details on bank or vendor letterhead. B, a voided check. C, a phone call to the vendor. Or D, 2 or more. or E, none of the above. So go ahead and select which option fits your current or more closely fits your current process. And we'll give about 10 more seconds for you to go ahead and get voting. So go ahead and we'll close that in about 5 more seconds. All right, so it looks like we have most folks have voted. So I am going to go ahead and close that. And now let's get that shared. Okay, so it looks like the majority have 2 or more of the above. So maybe you are collecting the bank details and making the phone call, or maybe you're also including a voided check as a requirement as well. So that's great. 21% have that confirmation phone call to the vendor before they change bank details. And then 2% have none of the above. So again, hopefully we can get, and then 2% only require a voided check. But with all of these, hopefully we can get you to have some immediate manual takeaways, and then also a solution, an automation solution to add that extra layer of security. So thanks everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. We will continue. All right, so let's start again with my proprietary 3-step process: authentication, validation, and management. And we'll talk about, we'll go over that, and then we'll talk about how you can use this process to help in the collection and validation of bank details. So this is the 3-step process, and the first step is authentication, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of the vendor documentation. So the data source is who is sending, and the delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. Now, if you have a vendor portal, then you would probably rely on that vendor portal for authentication, since the login process, and hopefully includes MFA, will authenticate the vendor. But if you're dealing with documents that come via email or fax or even hard copy, if some of you are back in the office, then you really want to authenticate the data source, which is the focus of this webinar, since we are focusing on receiving vendor banking via email. Now, step 2 is validation, where now that you have authenticated who's sending you that information, now you're going to take that information, in this case banking details, and you're going to validate that data before it is entered into your accounting system or ERP. Now, the third step is management, where you really maintain those existing vendor records, either by inactivating those vendors you haven't done business with in 15, 18, 24 months, whatever works for your company, and then the ones that remain active to revalidate that information. And this step also includes internal controls and best practices for managing your vendor data. And so now we're going to look at how to apply the steps of the authentication, validation, management process to collecting and validating banking to avoid fraud and pay the right vendor. So first, authentication and vendor banking. So I'd like to just start this off with, when you contact your bank to inquire about your bank account, what do they ask you? Well, if you go online to sign in, hopefully some type of MFA, you are authenticated, and you get to interact with your account online. But if you call, or if you email your bank, most likely you would call. But when you call, they will authenticate you by asking you 2 to 3 questions to verify you are who you say you are. only then do they discuss the issue or the reason for your call. And you need to do the same thing when you receive requests to update banking. You need to authenticate the requester, whether they are a vendor or an employee submitting documents on behalf of the vendor. And you can do that by asking 2 to 3 identifying questions. So for vendors, you can request confirmation of 2 to 3 validations only the vendor or an employee of the vendor would know, and have 4 or 5 or more to choose from so that the same questions are not asked each time. Another critical key is to make sure you're not asking for elements on the same document. And so this is the reason you see on the screen for the different columns. So for example, you don't want to ask for an invoice number and an invoice date, since that information is on the same document. Better is to ask for an invoice number and the last 4 digits of the tax ID, or maybe for a valid purchase order and the last 4 digits of the existing bank account. For new vendors, you can ask for the buyer or the name of the employee that requested the service, contract number, invoice number. And overall, if you receive any pushback for this authentication process for the vendor, you do have to wonder if whether or not they have the existing, if they don't have the existing vendor information, whether or not they really have the authority to change bank details. And in most cases, if you push back on a true cyber criminal or fraudster, they will just terminate that whole process and go to the next potential victim that does not ask these types of questions where it's easier. Now, for internal employees, yes, you may need to authenticate employees if your email system does not flag emails as external, or if employees email you outside of the work email system, or call you on their cell phones. And we certainly saw a mixture of that as many of us had that abrupt change to work remotely last year. Now, you can do the same, request confirmation of 2 to 3 validations that only the employee would know, and that you or your team has access to verify. So for example, you could ask for their next level up and their cubicle number. Now, once they successfully authenticate, instead of accepting their banking details on company or bank letterhead, which can be forged, or maybe in addition to accepting their banking details on those documents, send them a branded ACH form and require authenticating data on the form. So only send the form to those that authenticate, because you don't want a cyber criminal trying to gather information for this form. Now, I do recommend that on the form you require for a bank change, existing bank details or the last 3 payments with deposit dates and amounts. You can also request other authenticating data such as their full tax ID or any other unique element that your company may have and that the vendor would also have. Now, a best practice for this branded ACH form is to make sure you change it every year, because if you're only sending it to those vendors that have authenticated and you receive a previous version, that can be an indication of fraud. And then also do not post it on your company website, again, because you only wanted to send it to those that have authenticated. Now, validation and vendor banking. So once you receive the company branded ACH form back, you want to validate the bank data, and you want to start with the bank branch information. So the routing number, the ABA number, the SWIFT or the BIC code. And you want to make sure that your vendor's payment will be successful, because banks merge and get acquired all the time, and that can change those numbers. And so you can do that. The Federal Reserve offers lookups for the ABA routing number, and you do still want that too, because in some cases, ACH and wire, they do have different routing numbers, and your vendors may not know that. So you want to make sure it's going to be successful and that you're using the right routing number for your right type of payment. And then Swift.com has a lookup so that you can verify a Swift code and a bit code. Now, before we get to the second part of validation, I do have a second poll, and that poll is, let me get that up. Do you trust your current bank account validation process? And quick yes or quick no, go ahead and get voted on that. And yeah, I can kind of see where this is going. So I'll give 10 more seconds for everyone to get their quick polling vote in. All right, so we've got about 5 more seconds. Go ahead. All right, I still see some voting going on, so I'll let that continue. All right, so it looks like we have most folks have voted, and I'm going to go ahead. Nope, we still got some coming in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that voting. And then let's go ahead and share. So the question is, do you trust your current bank account validation process? So we had it was a close split. So 53% says yes, and 47% said no. So let's see if we can add some value to actually both sides that indicated that they have some type of bank account validation process, and see if we can either give you for those that said no, identify what you can do, and then for those that said yes, see if we can add some value to that. So I'm going to go ahead and hide the poll, and let's go ahead and continue. All right, so the second step of validation is verifying whether the vendor owns that bank account. And the reason you want to validate this, of course, is to ensure that your electronic payments are paid to the correct vendor and not a fraudulent bank account. Now, you may be able to have that validation with your bank, either through a pre-note or a micro deposit, but especially with a pre-note through your bank, there's really no guarantee that the vendor name will be returned, so that might not be 100%, and then there may be additional days of validation and managing that process with your vendor, so that can take additional time and just be more labor intensive as well. Now, the other option we do have on the call, nsKnox, they do have a database pre-note process for both US and non-US bank, where you'll be able to immediately search your database, see if your vendor is there, and again, that can save you time when changing your vendor's banking. But I'll let Natai and Sarah tell you more about that during that section. And then the last step is the management and vendor banking. So now, once you've authenticated by requiring authentication of the sender and included authenticating data on the company branded ACH form, validated the bank branch, validated the bank account information, here are 3 additional steps you can take to add more security. One is confirmation with the vendor by phone that they actually did send that request in. And a best practice is to confirm using contact information on the vendor record, not in the email. And if possible, confirm with a different employee than the one that made the request. The second best practice is to send a notification to the vendor. So the same way that your bank or PayPal or Amazon or Netflix or Hulu, you guys can tell what I've been doing this past year, they will send you a notification email that information on your account has been changed. And if you did not initiate the change, to take action. And you need to do the same thing with your vendors. That can give you that additional time to identify that it was a fraudulent transaction versus waiting for the vendor to recognize or realize that a payment is late. And then the third one is to review a report of added or change vendor bank details. So this is an internal control, and management can review a report of all vendors that were added or updated since the last pay run. It's really a compensating control that was used when, or that is used when there is a segregation of duties issue in AP. However, you can also use it to catch fraud before that fraudulent payment is made. I had one client that verified the support for any invoice above $300,000 where there was a recent bank change. All right, and then just to do a quick recap, these are my immediate takeaways. And if you do not have them as part of your manual process to collect and add or update vendor banking, please consider adding them to prevent fraudulent payments. And yes, they do add extra steps and can take more time, but with the average business email compromise scams rising to $70,000 or $90,000 per incident last year, and also continuing to hear about scams where companies like yours are paying in the millions, it's definitely worth it. And then speaking of worth it, I am now going to turn it over to nsKnox to talk about their solution for bank account ownership, so you can be sure to always pay the right vendor. So Nitai, it's going to come over to you.
Thanks, Debra. Are you making me the presenter? Yeah. There you
Yes, it
go.
should be coming over to you. Yeah, perfect.
And are you seeing the corporate payment screen here, fighting fraud and corporate payments?
All right, so let me see that. Yes, I do see it on the screen.
Perfect. Thanks, Debra. And hi again, everybody. Well, Debra shared with us some interesting information and statistics around the problem of payment fraud, and then some great best practices around the processes for account validation. And what I'd like to do is share with you a bit around how the use of technology can actually help you automate these processes, increase your efficiency and effectiveness while reducing the risk of payment fraud. So to do that, let's first have another look at the problem. It is actually bigger in my mind than validating the details when you just receive them. Now, different companies have different processes, and yours may be slightly different, but typically what we're seeing is organizations have a process to onboard new vendors and update their banking details. And while you're doing this, you enter data in your ERP system. It then becomes data at rest as part of your ERP system. And at a later time, it is being used to actually affect payments. So you go over the invoices, group them into payment proposals, and eventually transfer those payment instructions and payment files into the bank or the clearinghouse. And the big problem, if we want to really consider it that way, is that outsiders and insiders will try to substitute the correct banking details with fraudulent ones throughout the entire journey, the entire fund transfer journey or the procure to pay journey, and they'll do that using multiple attack vectors. We did touch business email compromise being the subject of this webinar, the primary one. In a way, this is part of a bigger family called social engineering. We've heard some of the statistics around this. I think most of the people are pretty familiar with that. I just want to say that nowadays, this is no longer just emails. Fraudsters today are also using more sophisticated techniques including phone spoofing and phone hijacking, and even deepfake AI-based voice cloning, which means that when you're speaking to somebody and think you may be confirming details over the phone, you can't even be sure you're actually speaking to the right person. So definitely be aware of that. Now, social engineering in general will target the input into your system. It is trying to trick you yourselves or your employees into entering fraudulent details right from the get-go. But this doesn't stop here. Everybody hates to talk about this, but unfortunately, we do have bad insiders amongst our employees. And if we hear anything from PwC about that, then they indicated in their last study last year that 50% of economic crime is actually committed by internal actors, either acting on their own or collaborating with outsiders. So this is kind of scary because people on the inside, they know the controls, they know the process, they know the system. And while we hate to think about anybody from the finance department or from IT messing with the data, they're the ones that can actually have access to data right from the beginning, and they can input the wrong details if the right controls are not in place. They can manipulate data after it's entered, either directly in the underlying database or using their credentials, and they can even sometimes mess with payment transactions right in payment files. So a real risk to consider. And then lastly, it's what we call the pure cyber attacks. These are typically designed to either steal your credentials and enter data on your behalf, or malicious software, which does this automatically, manipulating data in your ERP system or in your payment files. Now, if you feel safe, then I would advise think again. IDC have published a report last year indicating that almost 2/3 of the companies surveyed have indicated that their ERP system have been hacked or compromised in the past couple of years. So net, I think when we're considering a solution and automation, we really need to think about the overall picture, not just in terms of validating account details while we're entering them or updating details, but also on an ongoing basis to continuously verify the integrity of data stored in our ERP system, and definitely when we use it to effect payments. Now, why am I here speaking about all this? It's because I'm working for nsKnox, and what we're about is fighting payment fraud and providing B2B payment security. A bit about us at nsKnox. We were founded by the smiling gentleman here, and he's smiling because he's a serial entrepreneur. He's mostly known as the founder and former chairman and CEO of CyberArk, one of the world's leading cybersecurity company. We are partners with Microsoft, who's one of our investors as well as with KPMG, and are serving customers together. And our customers are really coming from across all different verticals and industries. You can see some of the names on the slide here, and we'll hear from Viga in a second. Having said that, anybody making electronic payments or receiving electronic payments should actually consider a solution like nsKnox, whether you're in manufacturing or financial services, insurance, in electricity, in medical care or devices, or what have you. It is relevant for you. And our role in life is to make sure that no finance professional wakes up one morning realizing that they're $2 million short or worse than that. Now, given that any of the organizations that are on this call and any of your customers or any of your vendors could actually fall victim to payment fraud, what we do at nsKnox is to offer a holistic end-to-end payment protection solution that protects both incoming payments as well as outgoing payments. We want to protect your incoming payments, so we want to make sure that if a customer needs to pay you $1 million, it actually gets to you. If it doesn't, you may think it's their responsibility, but still nobody likes a $1 million hit to the cash flow. But we've seen cases where customers can't pay again, and we've also seen cases where the fault actually comes from within your organization, in any way we want to try and prevent this. And then protecting outgoing payments, this one is kind of obvious. We definitely want to make sure we're paying only valid accounts and not fraudsters. Now, given the subject of this webinar, our focus is obviously on outgoing payment security, and that's what we want to be discussing and demonstrating. But before we demonstrate this, I'd like to invite Sarah to share with us some of her experiences and insights. And Sarah, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Again, I'm Sarah Quayle. I'm here to tell you about our experience and our implementation of nsKnox. Again, I have a background in finance and marketing, and I've been with Viga for 2.5 years. Just a little background of Viga. Viga is a global plumbing manufacturing company that supplies to commercial, industrial, and residential companies. We have a very long history. It was started in 1899 when the founder created the brass beer tap. They quickly changed to the plumbing manufacturing business. In 1999, Viga was introduced to the North America company, and we are currently in Broomfield, Colorado, where we have our corporate headquarters, and we also have a training seminar center. I'll have you switch to the next couple slides there. So Viga specializes in an innovative press piping technology. We have several different products that stand us apart from our traditional plumbing needs. So we have a press technology, a mega press technology, and we also specialize in heating and cooling. Like many of you, we were facing instances of cyber attacks and email phishing schemes, and so we decided that we needed to advance our bank verification process. Pre-2019, we were not doing any bank verification. Post-2019, we started doing a manual process of calling each vendor and verifying bank details. In 2021, we put the nsKnox verification system into place. So like I said, in 2019, everything changed for Viga. We were hit with a massive phishing email attempt that cost our company a significant amount of money. The company sent an email to our AP team, and we transferred a significant amount of money to a fraudulent vendor. We continue to see these phishing attempts, and they're very advanced and sophisticated. It's extremely hard for my AP team to manage that and to really understand what is a valid vendor change and what isn't. After 2019, we implemented some new controls, and I was placing a phone call to each supplier when there was a vendor change sent through. This was extremely manual. I was making several repeated phone calls to verify data. I was unsure of who I was calling, who I was contacting, relying on phone numbers and phone numbers off of invoices and what I Googled. We also are global suppliers, so I was hit with time zones and language barriers. And really it was causing a delay in verifying this bank detail and making sure our suppliers were paid on time. 2021, we went out and we decided we needed something that wasn't manual and was more secure. So we started speaking to nsKnox. And this process has made my life personally a lot easier, and it's more secure for the company and a better solution for our environment. We have our procurement department that supplies our AP team with the bank details. These are global suppliers again, so they are giving us that contact information, both large and small suppliers. We worked with nsKnox and have developed a branded email that we send out to each new supplier, and it gives them a simple link and email instructions on how to do this verification portal. All of the communication after that fact is completed by nsKnox. It's extremely handoff for me. I don't have to interact with the supplier. When that process has been completed, I receive an email back from nsKnox saying they've completed the verification process and they are ready to set up and pay. The verification portal is extremely easy to use. It gives me that secondary check that all of the bank details and the supplier name and account details are correct. And then at that point, we make that master data change in our system. This has been a audit sufficient backup process for us. We do a yearly audit, and this allows us to show that we verified every change that was made. The time and the speed of the process, it's a quick turnaround. I'm not delayed, and I'm able to get these suppliers set up and paid in a timely manner. And most importantly to me, my time has been saved, and I feel really secure in the process, and that it is the most secure process we can put into place for our company. Just a few tips from my end on how to make this successful implementation. We coordinated our process with our procurement department. They're aware of how we are doing the bank verification and validation process, and they're on board. They are aware that no payments will go out the door until we have secured the validation process. We document and train our teams on what this process is and how long it will take to verify that data. And we are very secure and confident in what we have validated and verified. And this is something that we've taken to our executive committee and focus really on the security and how this is a secure platform, and we're not making that phone call to suppliers, and we are secure. They've completed all of that without us having to do that manual process. Thank you. I appreciate your time, and please let me know if you have any questions.
And thank you, Sarah. And for everybody on the call, we're definitely having some time for questions at the end of it. Great insights, and thanks, Sarah, for your recommendations. Truly appreciated. And with that, I'd like to now move into talking a bit and demonstrating the nsKnox solution that Sarah mentioned. So the solution is essentially comprised of 3 functional modules. The first one deals with payee details validation. This one works the same way for domestic suppliers and for international suppliers, and essentially allow our customers and will allow you to validate any banking details for any of your vendors globally. So any account anywhere using the same process, the same technology. And it does this by relying on data from trusted sources, mainly the banking system itself, cross-referenced with other databases to ensure that bank account ownership is validated, that you are becoming aware of the entity name, the entity ID, which is as or sometimes even more important, their business address, where they are in the world, and the fact that they're the positive owner of the bank account that they claim to be. And this is extremely powerful. This one will take care of the input into your system. After you've used this service and have validated the bank account, you can feel much more secured when you store it in your ERP system. But it doesn't stop here. The second module provides you with functionality to protect your master data on an ongoing basis. And what it allows you to do is ensure the integrity of this data is maintained. And I'll show you how this works, but essentially what it does is it tracks changes to your master data, but not only does it provides you with reports on the changes performed, it also cross-references these with a validation status of these accounts to make sure that if changes made, the account details are still valid per your policy. And lastly, the solution also offers payment transaction verification, sort of like as the end gate before you send these payment files and transactions into the bank or the clearinghouse for processing, or before you approve to actually make the payments. You want to make sure that these payment files only contain instructions that meet your policy and only to valid accounts. Now, all this is protected by an external security layer that we call cooperative cybersecurity. I'm not going to make this a tech rehearsal on how this is accomplished, but what this does, it provides an external, very strong cybersecurity layer that ensures that it's not enough to manipulate your data. A fraudster needs to also manipulate data in this external layer to be successful, which makes it much, much harder and reduces any single point of failure. And in terms of functionality, the portal itself could be accessed the solution itself could be accessed either using a portal. This requires no integration at all and will allow you to start using this tomorrow. You could also automate certain actions using file-based automations, and open REST APIs are also available so that this can be integrated with any ERP system as well. Let's quickly move into demonstrating the solution itself. And so the first thing that we do when we start working with customers typically is we baseline their master data. This means that a copy of your master data is now secured on the CCS platform, allowing you to have this external security layer in place. Over time, as soon as updates are being made, it will get synchronized with this, which will allow you to keep track of the situation. One thing you could do with a solution, if you have vendors that were not validated yet, is to initiate what we call a self-validation. Well, some of your vendors, which you may be paying low amounts or just one time, you may want to validate yourself instead of going through a more secured validation process. This means that the tool provides you the ability to keep track of how you validate. For example, you could say, I'm validating this account because I verified details over the phone. And then you could enter who did you speak to, what were the phone numbers, when was it, describe the call, and add any attachments such as a void check and so on. When you hit self-validate, it will record in this external database that the account is validated by you and only for you. Now, this by itself does not provide you with additional information. However, it does make sure that you comply with your own process, and with that alone, it increases your security. If you do want the more robust and secured validation that Sarah mentioned, you could actually direct your suppliers into the validation portal. This is a multilingual portal. It will help your suppliers even if they're in China or in France or in anywhere else, multiple languages. And once they get there, they'll see in their language the instructions as well as any frequently asked questions and answers. And they'll be directed to go through an easy two-step process they only need to go through once. The first step would be to register. Just enter company details. You know, this is a company in the UK. This is their tax number, the contact details, and most importantly, the banking details they claim to be correct. But that's not enough because anybody could claim any details to be correct. We want to make sure they're validated. When they hit register, the engine behind the scenes is going to examine these details. If the account is already valid, it's going to tell them nothing else is required and everything's good. Otherwise, based on details such as the country this is based in, the bank in which the account is managed, and other details, follow-up instructions will follow. I'll just give an example for instructions that may appear for some vendors in the US. So in this example, nsKnox will transfer a random amount to their account, and they're requested upon receiving this random amount, please return the same amount back to an nsKnox validation account. You can see the details here. The important piece is the fact that they've sent the money back. And the reason is that the nsKnox technology kicks in. It traces the transaction back to the source and in a way gives you a view into their know your customer data that their bank stores on them. And it doesn't matter if it's in China, in the UK, or in the US. Now, when the process is complete, and as Sarah have indicated before, the nsKnox account validation experts will help your suppliers as needed and follow up with you. And when it's complete, you will be notified and they will be notified. And you could now search for their details in the portal. And this one's really straightforward. You could either do this using a search by name or by ID. If we look at the companies whose details I showed before, Foroli, this is the UK-based entity. The portal will tell you it's in the UK. Here are their IDs, like their tax number, DUNS number if they have one, and an nsKnox unique ID, the KNOX ID. It will tell you their address, the official business address for them, and will allow you to search for their account. Now, this one's an international one, so I'll use Swift to search. Obviously, if it was a domestic US account, you could also search for that one. So entering the Swift BIC and then the account number, as soon as you hit validate, it's going to come back and tell you they were standard validated. You know all these details to be correct. The ID, a strong identifier, extremely important. Their name, their address, and the fact that they're the positive owner of this bank account. You can now feel much safer storing this data in your ERP systems. The other two functions I mentioned, and we'll just real quick go through them, has to do with maintaining the integrity of your data at all times. This is where you could, at any given point in time, synchronize the fresh copy of your master data and validate that the details there are correct. If you're using the portal, like I'm demonstrating now, to do this on demand, you can either drag and drop or choose a file. And once you've done this and hit submit, the engine's now going to look at the details loaded and compare them with past versions. And the results that are going to come is first a changelog. In this example, Foroli just added a new bank account, and we've added this into the system. But notice that it's not just telling us that a new bank account was added, it also shows us that this one was standard validated, i.e. all the details are correctly valid, and you can see all the details right here. If anything in our database is not the way it should be, like in the case of Viva la Repubblica here in France, you can see that a new bank account was added. However, it is not validated, which means we need to investigate. And what's really powerful about this is way before we've used this data to affect payments. And this actually replaces manual audits where you selectively look at the process and instead can automatically scan all entries to ensure they're valid. And then lastly, there is the ability to scan payment files. System supports all types of payment files and formats, and new ones could be easily introduced to the system. When you scan these payment files, and again, both synchronization of master data files and payment files could be automated, but when you do that, all payment transactions get scanned, and any ones that do not meet your policy for validation or thresholds will be flagged. As an example here, you can see payment was rejected because the account is not validated at the sufficient level. It actually is not validated at all. You may set a rule saying up to $1,000, I'm okay paying even if it wasn't validated, but above that, raise an alert. The second problem here, we're seeing a payment was rejected because the account is not in the master vendor file, which definitely is a problem. You never want to be paying accounts that were not, are not in your master data. So this was a rather quick demonstration. Obviously, would love to follow up with any of you and present this in more detail, should you be interested. And that concludes the demonstration part of the solution. To summarize this, why you should be using nsKnox is because A, it's global. It will validate accounts anywhere in the world for you. It provides end-to-end security, not just in the input, but also for data at rest and payments. And it is deterministic. It's not trying to guess if an account is valid. Either it's valid or not. All right, thank you, Debra. Sending it back to you.
Thanks, Natai. I think I took it a little early. Apologies for that. Okay, so let's go ahead straight back into our third poll question, and I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And that third poll question is, are you 100% sure that your vendor's payment was successful, that you paid the right vendor? And this is another quick one, just a yes or a no. Go ahead and answer that. And I think many of you may have, you know, some more things to think about as you're answering this question, especially after hearing Sarah talk about the pain points that she had in trying to manually validate that vendor banking information to make sure they weren't sending it to a fraudulent vendor. And then seeing that great demo from nsKnox about how they can add that additional security via automation. And so it looks like we have most folks that voted. So I'm going to go ahead and close the voting, and let's see what our the results were. So we had 69% indicated that no, they do not, they are not 100% certain that they paid the right vendor, and 31% did say yes. So we've got the majority of no, and so again, that may have given you, you know, the great presentations with the manual takeaways of the manual processes that you can immediately put into place, along with adding that automation security layer on top of those processes. So let's go ahead then. Let me hide that. And then now we're going to go ahead and move to our Q&A session. We'll get through as many as we can. If your question is not answered during this time, we will follow up with you via email. If you think of any questions afterwards, go ahead and use the email addresses that are on the screen to follow up and ask additional email questions after this webinar. So we do have a few questions in, and Natai, I think these are, we've got a couple that are for you. So the first one is the nsKnox solution compatible with all ERPs, namely SAP?
The short answer would be yes. It is definitely possible to integrate the nsKnox solution with SAP. That's the short one. The longer one is you could definitely start working with a solution without the integration using the portal mode, and at any point in time later decide to integrate it with SAP.
Okay, and then the second question is, what is the participation rate when launching the solution?
I'm not sure what exactly the question meant by participation rate. If it's around vendors that are going through the process, then it's extremely high.
So we have another one that may be that's similar to that one, and this one specifically directed that question to Sarah. And so on average, how long does it typically take a vendor to enroll in nsKnox, and when your company receives validation and back from nsKnox? So Sarah, that one's kind of related based on your experience.
We're looking at about a 7-day average right now, which I think is quicker than when I was making phone calls.
Yeah, and you know that I'm very glad you shared that pain point, because even before, you know, the chaos of the last year, it was hard to get these vendors on the phone, and so that is a big pain point. I'm sure a lot of attendees on the call that really resonated with that just manual process of those repeated phone calls to get a vendor on the phone. Okay. So the next one is, how do you make the market proactive versus reactive, or implementing a solution like nsKnox after experiencing a fraud loss? What role does the Treasury Bank play in checking payments before sending? So Natai, I think that one might be more for you.
So I think there were like a couple questions in there.
Yeah.
maybe one of them is how to, increase awareness and such after an incident has occurred. I have to say, after the incident has occurred, it's a bit of a problem. Sometimes the banks would try to help, but oftentimes we're seeing certain companies that are facing challenges with receiving help. They may get the help from their bank, but typically, especially if international banks are involved, everybody wants to protect the privacy of their customers, even if it is a fraudster. So that would be, really hard in terms of their responsibility. At the end of the day, if fraudulent instructions are being sent, then, hate to say it, but it becomes, your problem because you provided these instructions. And while in some countries, some of the banks may do some checks around the name and around the validity, it's not, really the case. And this is why I think it becomes the responsibility of finance professionals, the Treasury Department, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and so on, to make sure that we do the proper due diligence before we send the instructions to the bank. In terms of our role in this, we've designed a suite of solutions here that start with some simple ones that allow customers to simply register and validate their bank account in the in a shared repository. The first thing everybody should do is have their account registered so that when people search for them using this solution, they'll find them immediately. The second thing you could do is let everybody in your network and all your customers and business partners know that they can validate your bank account before they make payments to you. It's the same problem that you're trying to avoid. You want to help your customers and business partners avoid the same problem, and then implement, the best practices that you have shared, Debra, and a technology solution like nsKnox, from my perspective, preferably nsKnox, to make sure that you automate all this and you receive, account ownership confirmation based on third-party data, not on the interested party, and you continuously validate them all the way through to payment.
All right. Well, thank you, Natai, for that. And thanks, everyone, for all of the questions that are coming. We did get quite a few. We will answer the remaining questions that we didn't get to today via email. And again, if you think of any additional questions, please reach out to the email addresses that you see on the screen. I want to thank both Sarah and Natai for presenting today. And I want to thank everyone for attending. We are now at the top of the hour, and this webinar will now be concluded. Thank you.
Thank you.